Okay, welcome to our series on complex numbers, and in this video we'll focus again on the imaginary number, and we are going to expand on how to use the imaginary number. So in a previous video we learned that the imaginary number is noted as I, and it is the square root of -1. We know that this number cannot be plotted on a number line, and also that it cannot be simplified further. But look what happens if I square I. So I squared would be the square root of -1 squared. And that simply is equal to -1. Now if I take the cube of I have the square root of -1 cubed, which is equals to the square root of -1 squared times the square root of -1, which is equals to -1 times I, or simply -I. And if I raise I to the fourth power, I have the square root of -1 to the power of 4. And that is equals to the square root of -1 squared times the square root of -1 squared, which is -1 times -1, which is equals to +1. So what we are seeing is that I is equals to the square root of -1, that I squared is equals to -1, I to the power of 3 is equals to -I, and I to the power of 4 is equals to +1. So a rule that we can use is if I raise I to the power of 1n, that will be equal to the square root of -1. If I raise I to the power of 2n, that will be equals to -1. I to the power of 3n would be equals to -I. And I to the power of 4n would be equals to +1. So let's say we want to find I to the power of 2006. That is equals to I to the power of 2 times 1003. So I know that that value would be equal to -1, because this is the same as saying I to the power of 2n. And notice that this is a real solution. So if I focus on I can have a non-real solution or a real solution of -1 when it's raised to the power of 2n. When it's raised to the power of 3n, I have a non-real solution again. And when it's raised to the power of 4n, I again have a real solution of +1. Now let us consider other applications of I. If I ask you for the square root of 4, that will be equal to 2. But if I ask you for the square root of -4, that is equals to the square root of 4 times -1. And we know that we can split the square root up into two parts. So the square root of 4 is equal to 2 times the square root of -1. And that is equals to 2i. So now what we are learning is that we can simplify a square root when it is negative. Another example is the square root of -36. That is equals to the square root of 36 times -1, which is equals to 6 times the square root of -1, and that is equals to 6i. How about the square root of -8? We can rewrite -8 as 4 times 2 times -1. Now, the square root of 4 is equals to 2, and we cannot solve the square root of 2 because that's an irrational number. And then we have the square root of -1. So the square root of -8 is equals to 2 square root 2i. And those are some practical tips on how we would apply the imaginary number in complex numbers.